Hello and welcome to Book Breaks. We're so thrilled to welcome back our friend Garrett Graff and his book, When the Sea Came Alive, An Oral History of D-Day. And we'd like to thank viewers like you for making Book Breaks possible. I'm your host, Gina, and I'm joined by my friend Ryan. Hey, Ryan, who will take your questions in the second half of the program. And without further ado, we're so thrilled to welcome back Garrett Graff, who's the author of The Only Plane in the Sky, An Oral History of 9/11 and Watergate, A New History, which is a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Welcome, Garrett. We're so thrilled to have you here.
Thanks. I'm pleased to be here, and I'm slightly embarrassed to be wearing the exact same blazer that I am in my author photo, which never actually happens.
Oh, well, first for everything on Book Breaks. We love it. Now, just starting off, can you give us an overview of this book and the unique way that it's structured?
Sure. So I wrote, as probably some of the listeners know, a oral history of 9/11 that came out in 2019 that was called The Only Plane in the Sky, that brings together the voices of, that was about 480 people who had lived 9/11 over the course of that single day, morning to night, coast to coast. And I was interested in diving into D-Day for very similar reasons. In much the same way that 9/11 is the most famous and turning point-ish day of the 21st century, D-Day, June 6th, 1944, is arguably the most important single day of the 20th century. And it's another mass event, 150,000 Allied troops, about 1 million Allied personnel in motion across the United Kingdom and the Channel that day, air, land, and sea. And it is a moment in some ways that is right at the edge of a different envelope as 9/11. So my 9/11 book came out in 2019, which was the 18th anniversary of 9/11, which was the first year that you had men and women going into basic training to deploy to Iraq and Afghanistan who did not remember, or who had been born after 9/11. The first year that you had people heading off to college who had been born after 9/11. So it was right at this moment when 9/11 was beginning to slip from memory into history. And D-Day is at the far other end of that spectrum. Last year, when this book came out, was the 80th anniversary, which was marked in such a big way overseas and at home, I think in part because it also marked effectively the passing of the greatest generation. That, again, million people across the United Kingdom in motion on that day. And the UK now estimates there are just about 300 living British participants left from D-Day. The United States probably has, a couple thousand, but still a vastly dwindling number. And so I wanted to sort of capture this moment in oral history, because at this moment we have effectively every first person memory of D-Day that we will ever have. And to try to recreate that day as it was experienced in the words of the people who experienced it, at a moment when we're sort of handing the world that they created over to a generation where no one will remember or know or have participated in D-Day.
And what does the title of the book signify?
So the title of the book, When the Sea Came Alive, is actually a quotation from a young German soldier who was speaking on about his memory of really waking up in one of the bunkers overlooking the invasion coast and looking out at this incredible amphibious invasion force that had arrived, much to the German surprise, off the shore that morning. And so he looked out and he was like, the sea had come alive. It was packed full of ships, and I knew uh, in that moment that sort of he and his colleagues were in for a very bad day.
Yeah, and you cover a lot of sort of the known figures of the event, but there's a couple people who really stuck out to me, and one was Waverly Woodson. Can you tell us about Waverly Woodson, who sort of is a primary character throughout?
Yeah, D-Day is particularly in the way that we mostly remember it and mythologize it, in almost entirely male event and an entirely almost white male event. Of the 150,000 Allied troops that landed on D-Day, about 2,000 of them were black, and they were primarily uh, stevedores, sort of logistics personnel, and there was a single combat unit, single black combat unit that landed on D-Day, and it was the 320th Balloon Barrage Battalion at Omaha Beach. And their job was, it was an anti-aircraft unit, and their job was to raise the barrage balloons that would sort of keep German aircraft, the Luftwaffe, from swooping in down low over the beach for bombing or strafing runs. And uh, one of the sort of major characters in the book there that I zero in on is the medic at Omaha Beach in that balloon battalion, Waverly Woodson Jr., who was the combat medic and one of the, he lands around 10 a.m. on June 6th, 1944, about 2-3 hours into the invasion, at Omaha Beach, which is the deadliest and bloodiest portion of all of the Allied landings. And he arrives on the beach already wounded himself. He's actually wounded in the course of getting ashore and hit by shrapnel on his landing craft, and then proceeds to be one of the first combat medics to the beach, and ends up treating, we don't know exactly, but in the range of several hundred um, uh, casualties over the course of that day, stays on the beach for more than 24 hours before he himself gets his wound treated and is evacuated. And, ends up treating a statistically significant portion of all the U.S. casualties on Omaha Beach that day, and is nominated by his commanders for the Medal of Honor. Now, this is where you sort of have to go back to World War II, which was a very different time and place for our country. And sort of I wrote in the book a bunch about the ways that our segregated army in World War II actually sort of exported this sort of Jim Crow South racial discrimination and segregation to the United Kingdom during the buildup for of the D-Day invasion forces. And in that army, there is not a single black soldier, sailor, Marine, airman, Coast Guardsman, service personnel of any kind, who receives the Medal of Honor in World War II. And he ends up, Waverly Woodson ends up getting the Bronze Star, which is, of course, a important and meritorious award, but it's definitely not the Medal of Honor. And he ends up in the 1990s. The Clinton administration tries to right this historic wrong of that no black soldier or military personnel received a Medal of Honor. They end up finding records of about 8 black soldiers who were considered for the Medal of Honor in World War II, and give 7 of them the Medal of Honor in the 1990s. Waverly Woodson is the only one who they find records that he was considered for the Medal of Honor and did not receive it. And his family has sort of kept at it, and with the help of the Maryland congressional delegation, including sort of very specifically Senator Chris Van Hollen, has kept pushing for this. And actually, when the book came out last year, he had not been recognized with anything more than the Bronze Star. And then after the book came out, and this, I want to be clear that this was in progress before my book came out, so I'm not in any meaningful way responsible for this. But after the book came out, the Army awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal, which is second only to the Medal of Honor. And it was a tremendous amount of work by historians in the Pentagon and Waverly Woodson's unit, as well as the family, as well as the attention of the congressional delegation, who went back into the mess of personnel records from World War II, most of which were actually lost in a devastating fire about 30 years ago, 40 years ago now. Almost all of actually the nation's World War II personnel records were lost in this devastating fire. And but they were able to find evidence in existing records of Waverly Woodson being considered for the Distinguished Service Medal. And that allowed the Army to at least give him that. And then the hope is that sort of years of further research will at some point get him the Medal of Honor.
Now, you have a lot of anecdotes about how Black soldiers were surprised by their treatment in the UK. Can you tell us about that? Because that was fascinating.
Yeah, there's a chapter. So the book is divided into very small chapters. I forget the number, 50, 60 chapters. And that one of the things, my 9/11 book, there's exactly one chapter before 9/11. There's sort of one chapter that like tells the story of September 10th. And then you're right into September 11th. And when I started this book, I had a sort of similar thought. Okay, you're telling the story of D-Day. You probably need to start noon on June 4th and then, throw people in. And as I got into it, what I realized was almost all of the success of D-Day takes place because of what happens long before D-Day. And so as it ends up, about 40% of the book is the story of the planning and the buildup and the logistics leading up to June 6th itself. And I actually think the most dramatic chapter of the book for me, a most interesting chapter, takes place before D-Day itself, which is the story of Dwight Eisenhower weighing the weather forecast on the weekend leading into June 6th and making this go, no-go decision for the entire invasion. And one of the chapters of the book deals with this massive army that the United States builds up over the course of 1942, 1943, 1944, in the in basically any spare corner of the United Kingdom, top to bottom. And we bring 1 million personnel to the country. By the morning of D-Day, 1/10 of the male population of Great Britain is actually American soldiers. And one of the sort of really big changes that come with that is the arrival of this segregated army into a country where there is no history of racial discrimination against blacks. And for the black soldiers, it is this incredible experience because they sort of show up and no one treats them differently. And it turns out, British women are just as happy to go out on dates and go dancing with and be drinking with in the pub a black soldier as they are a white soldier. And this is deeply upsetting for some of the white units from the segregated South, up to the point where the racial tension reaches a point where the army has to sort of declare sort of black nights in town and white nights in town so that the soldiers don't riot and end up fighting each other over the course of the months leading up to D-Day. And it's just incredible as you dive into both the logistics of D-Day, the operation, but then also the training and all of the planning that goes into D-Day. Again, this is not my original research, but I talk about it in the book. Recent historians have actually calculated now that more Americans died training for D-Day than on D-Day itself. And so, I tell one of those sort of chapters before you even get to June 6th is about something known as Exercise Tiger, which is the last full-scale dress rehearsal for the invasion for the units heading to Omaha Beach, to Utah Beach. And the UK actually, they evacuate an entire county of southern England that sort of looks geographically similar beach-wise to the Normandy landing zones. And they evacuate it of all civilians, close it down, and run through the spring of 1944 these full-scale dress rehearsals. I mean, the whole invasion fleet puts to sea, then turns around and comes back and invades England. And on the last of those for Utah Beach, there are German PT boats that get through the sort of defensive destroyer screen and are actually able to torpedo multiple landing craft in the middle of the night as this exercise is preparing for the invasion the next morning, the dress rehearsal invasion the next morning, and kill. We don't really know the actual number, but sort of upwards of 700 U.S. personnel in this dress rehearsal, which is actually far more soldiers than are killed in the actual Utah Beach invasion just a few weeks later. And Exercise Tiger was this terrible embarrassment and horrific incident for the Allied command, in part because they didn't have spare landing craft. And so this removed the literal last spare landing craft they had for the invasion itself. And it was entirely covered up for decades. And the Pentagon sort of only began to come clean about what happened and the scale of what happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Wow. Another hidden figure who I was fascinated by was Martha Gellhorn, who I, sadly only knew through her husband previously, I have to admit.
So Martha Gellhorn, um, sort of famous American European correspondent, war correspondent, most famous, as you said, actually as the one of the wives of Ernest Hemingway. And one of the sort of great threads of D-Day is that both of them go out on the D-Day invasion. And um, Ernest Hemingway writes this incredibly famous piece about what it's like actually being in the landing craft on the way up to the beach. Uh, and he never actually makes it to the beach. He stays in the landing craft and then sort of goes back to the troop transport and goes back to England. Martha Gellhorn actually becomes what sort of at least history generally remembers as the first woman to make it to the D-Day beaches. She was probably not technically that, but was at least close to it. Where she actually stows away aboard a hospital ship headed to D-Day and lands on the D-Day beaches after the invasion day itself. But while there's still incredibly few people who have actually made it to the beaches, and then races back to England and writes her own harrowing story of what it's like to actually be on the beaches of the D-Day beaches.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned sort of lack of representation being a myth that you sort of helped to dispel in this book. I was wondering what other sort of myths about this historic day.
Yeah, it's a fascinating day because of the mythology that has built up around it. It is this, uh, you know, uh, arguably one of the most popular historical stories of, at least modern times. And it was sort of funny trying to write a book about all of D-Day because my floor here in my office, piled up with, entire books written about, single units or single sections of the beach or, single threads of the logistics of the planning and, dozens of memoirs of people who had been involved because, sort of there's almost every sliver of D-Day has been examined in some ways. But part of what I was trying to do with this book was cut through some of the sort of big popular mythology that has grown up around D-Day, most of which is sort of has kernels of truth, but where the nuance and the subtlety of the point is actually important. And so, as a couple examples of that, one of the things I try to dispel is there was effectively no doubt that the Americans and the Allies would make it ashore on D-Day. That actually the idea of the sort of impregnable Atlantic wall, the sort of Nazi defense line, just wasn't accurate by the spring of 1944. That the German army of 1944 was a shadow of what it was, in 39, 40, 41, when it was on a tear across Europe. The primary defense units of the Atlantic Wall are either the very old, the very young, or actually conscripts. There's sort of this great series of stories where one set of soldiers come ashore on D-Day and are sort of confused to find themselves facing a unit that they think are actually Asians that turn out to be Mongolian conscripts who had been captured on the Russian front and then sort of sent to the Atlantic Wall and the coast of France, sort of under pressure to defend the wall involuntarily. And there were a lot of Polish conscripts, who are all too happy to surrender as soon as the Americans arrive. The British and Canadians arrive as well, and that much of the German army, at least in France in the spring of 44, has been reduced to horse-drawn carriages and bicycles, that they don't actually have the gasoline or the mechanized capability to be working, in sort of traditional, mobile mechanized units. And so, they're literally bicycling around to try to get reinforcements up to the wall on June 6th. And that the real question for the invasion force was not getting ashore, it was staying ashore. It was how well could the could the logistics hold up, could the troops hold up on day 3, day 4, day 5, as the Germans actually had their chance to get up to bring reinforcements up to the Normandy area and to bring more advanced panzer units and more elite units up. And in fact, when we talk about Normandy, D-Day, we often think of as the end. It's the triumph. It's the day that we get ashore. But for every soldier, paratrooper who lands in France on June 6th, D-Day is the start, not the end. And in fact, it takes the Allies 77 days to build up and break out of the Normandy coast beachhead. And the Normandy campaign, lasts through, the entire summer before they're really able to open up the road to Paris and get on the march towards Berlin.
Well, the time is just zooming by. So before I pass you back to Ryan, I can't believe that it's already at this point. I would be amiss not to talk to you about the audiobook of this work. Can you tell us what's so unique about this recording?
Yeah, the audiobook was an incredible effort by our audiobook producer, Scott Sherritt, who also was the audiobook producer behind my 9/11 book, Only Plane in the Sky, where he built out this incredible full cast. So, it's dozens and dozens of voices and archival material, so that it really sounds like you are listening to all, in the case of the D-Day book, 700 voices all the different accents and regionalities and ethnicities represented across the book. And it was an incredible effort. I'm incredibly grateful to him for making, no pun intended, the book come alive in the audiobook like that. And the audiobook actually won the Audie, which is the industry's highest audiobook award, for the best multi-voiced audiobook this year.
And features an award-winning Winston Churchill, as I've discussed.
Yes, and the Winston Churchill is incredible. It's an actor actually who plays Winston Churchill in the West End in the London theater world, and is as Winston as anyone could possibly be.
Well, on that note, I'm going to pass you over to Ryan, who's going to do our student scholar question of the week.
Excuse me. Yes, thank you so much, Gina, for that awesome back and forth. As we know, our loyal listeners know, but for folks who are newer to the program, a reminder, we always begin this portion of the program with our Student Scholar of the Week. So this is a weekly competition in which students have a chance to ask our guests a question for themselves and have a chance to win for themselves a $50 gift card, again, for themselves or and also for their teacher. So questions are always excellent, and this week is no exception. Our winner is Isaiah, who's a student in Miss D. Villa Stanza's class. Apologies for brutalizing that last name, but kudos to Isaiah and his teacher. He's a student in Clearview Regional High School, and the question is this. D-Day is mostly known for Omaha Beach, with with it being the main focal point in D-Day conversations. But what about Juneau, Sword, Utah, and Gold? What significance did they have on D-Day, and what were their reactions for the Allies, politically and in terms of military importance? The other beaches besides Omaha really is the thrust of the question from Isaiah.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and it's one that I really worked hard to try to equalize in the course of this telling, because we are, again, Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, the American mythology around D-Day has so zeroed in, really even just on Omaha Beach, even of the two beaches that the Americans had, of Utah and Omaha, uh, for some very real and valor-filled reasons, which is Omaha Beach was some of the worst fighting that we saw anywhere in all of World War II. At the same time, as Isaiah rightly points out in the question, Canada was in charge of the Juneau Beach, and then the UK did Gold and Sword, and Gold and Sword sort of anchor the eastern end of the the D-Day landing zones. Juneau's right in the center, and then there's Omaha, and then Utah anchors the far western side of the Normandy coastline. And it's actually the British who start out D-Day. The first operation of D-Day is this incredible airborne invasion to anchor what comes to be known as Pegasus Bridge on the far western side. And if the airborne units can't hold the western side, they fear that, the eastern side. If they can't hold the eastern flank there, they fear the Germans are going to be able to sort of race up reinforcements and then sort of sweep up the fighting before the beaches are really even established. And the British airborne units are able to crash land these glider units along the Pegasus Bridge in this incredibly tiny little area. I mean, it's one of the most audacious military operations we have sort of ever seen. I mean, if you think the helicopter piloting of the Osama bin Laden raid is good, imagine trying to do that in a balsa wood glider with 1940s technology. And what that becomes sort of the first fight, and then the invasions of Sword and Gold have their own incredible stories of bravery, including very notably Stanley Hollis, who is the only British soldier on D-Day to receive the Victoria Cross, which is Britain's highest award for valor. And then in some ways, what I found haunting about diving into this material and telling this story is, in some ways, Juneau is the most emotional of the beaches. Canada sees Canada bears the brunt of the disastrous raid at Dieppe, which sort of depending on whose version of history you believe, was either a raid or a attempt at an early meaningful invasion, and lose hundreds of personnel. I mean, almost the entire invasion force is wiped out. And so to be returning to the European continent, and for the Canadians charging ahead at Juno, it's this deeply emotional and sort of nationalistic moment to come ashore at Juno and to secure that beach. And again, there are pockets of some of these beaches at Gold Sword and Juno that are nearly as bloody, if not more bloody, man for man than what the first waves at Omaha Beach face.
Wow, fascinating. Great question and awesome response. Okay, our chat is really blowing up, so I'll get to as many questions as I can. Sam asks, could you talk a little bit about your approach to oral history? Were there any practitioners of the art of oral history that you particularly admired? Was this particularly challenging for you? This kind of new narrative?
Yeah, so I've spent most of the last decade now doing oral history on and off, both magazine style oral history, and then this was my second book of oral history. I was just telling Gina and Ryan have actually just finished my third book of oral history, which will come out in August, which is another World War II history, an oral history of the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about oral history, and what I try to do as I approach these projects is you're really trying to find the ordinary and the extraordinary in a moment like D-Day or 9/11. And what I mean by that is you're trying to find voices who can represent sort of the typical experience. What was it like being aboard the invasion fleet? What was it like being a paratrooper crossing the English Channel headed for the Normandy hedgerows? What was it like, being in the landing craft? What was it like being one of the German defenders? And then you're looking for the extraordinary, and you're looking for the voices who represent the truly atypical experiences. And so those are people like Stanley Hollis, the Victoria Cross winner. Those are voices like Dick Winters and the men of Easy Company, the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment that we now memorialize with Band of Brothers. I mean, this sort of incredible unit that begins their march to in Stephen Ambrose's words, Eagle's Nest, with the D-Day invasion. And what really stood out in the course of the D-Day book is coming to understand just how ordinary the extraordinary was on that morning of June 6, 1944. I mean, there are so many stories of soldiers and medics like Waverly Woodson and paratroopers, landing craft personnel from the Coast Guard and the Navy, who, if their story had happened on any other day of World War II, would be one of the most famous stories of all of World War II, but for that day, may not even be the most remarkable story of their 100 yards of French beach, and you look at the ranger units that storm ashore at Pointe du Hoc and climb the cliffs to try to silence the German gun batteries up there. You look at the men and women of the Maryland and Virginia men of the 29th Infantry Division who storm ashore in the first waves at Omaha Beach and are wiped out almost to a man. You look at the paratroopers who do this, are sort of dropped all over. And I tell the story. The final chapter of the book is sort of the one big tank battle of D-Day in the American sector, a battle for Lafayette Bridge, which is just this tiny, tiny bridge. I mean, the bridge is, a couple dozen yards long. I mean, it's a stone bridge. It's barely 2 lanes wide, if that. And becomes the scene of what one historian calls, the most fierce fighting that the U.S. Army faces anywhere in its entire history. It's a story that I would be surprised if, 3 in 100 readers of this book, know when they pick up the book, and yet is, one of the, bravest stories that you could possibly find in combat arms.
Wow, fascinating. Susan asked a short but I think important question. How did the Allies keep all of this secret? Or did they, I guess? I don't know.
Yeah. So they didn't use signal group chats to plan the D-Day invasion. And there's actually some really fascinating. I do a couple of chapters about the planning, the secrecy, the deception operations, because it was sort of a couple of different layers, some of secrecy, some of active deception, where the Allies realized they're not going to be able to keep secret the fact that we are planning an invasion. They're not going to be able to keep secret the fact that we're building up this massive invasion force, and that the only 2 things that they can really keep secret, the only 2 things that matter. And that's the specific date and the specific location. And so it's an enormous amount of effort that goes into, on the Allied side, keeping secret those 2 pieces of information. Up to and including that, most Allied personnel don't learn where they are going or when they are going until, literally 2, 3, 4 days ahead of the invasion in June. And then wrapped around that super intense secrecy around date and location are these incredible deception operations, which include creating an entire fake army of that's located in Western England, that with balsa wood tanks and entire fake empty encampments where there's a skeleton staff running around to keep the chimneys smoking to make it look like there are mass mess halls working around the clock, huge airfields filled with fake planes, set up for the invasion to make the Germans think that the invasion is sort of headed further west than it actually is. They create another fake army actually in the north of England that looks like it might be headed towards Norway, complete with, radio units making radio communication set up all across the north of England and the west of England, mimicking the radio traffic that an entire army would do. When they go out to bomb the targets along the Normandy coastline, they make sure that they are actually dropping more bombs on places where the U.S. is, where the Allies are not going to invade than they are on the actual Normandy coastline, because they really want to make sure that no one pays any particular attention to the Normandy coast. And then from there, they actually, on the night of the invasion, they actually send out sort of fake invasion armies headed in a couple of different directions to make the Germans sort of unsure where the actual invasion is going to take place. They target the radar installations to make sure that the Germans can't see them coming. And that all leads to this moment, When the Sea Came Alive, the title of the book again, where the Germans wake up in the morning of June 6th and are stunned to look out and see the Allies already in place outside off the coast, ready to invade.
Wow. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. As you know, we have so many teachers on the call, 200 plus people on the call, many of which are teachers. And Austin asked a really interesting and relevant question, I think. Given the time limitations associated with teaching history at the high school level, are there any specific chapters you might recommend above the others for teaching purposes? In addition, are there any good primary sources you recommend to help introduce those students, or really good primary sources teachers can use regarding D-Day? And I'll just say a quick plug for all the teachers and everyone on the call. There's links in the chat to get your hands on this great book, and we encourage everyone to do so and integrate it into your lesson planning if appropriate.
Boy, that is a fantastic question, and I wish I had a little bit of time to think about it, because I think for me, there are sort of these little slices of the book that really stand out. The chapters about the buildup of the invasion force in England, is a pretty different history than we're used to talking about. I mean, that's where I talk about, the tensions in a segregated army, the tensions with the English. One of the sort of myths, and I think you sort of saw this last summer in the celebrations around the 80th, is this idea of, the United States and England, we were the greatest of allies. This was the greatest, working relationship in the history of the world in World War II. And that's really not the story of the British and the Americans working together. It really takes from 1941 to 1944 for the US and the UK to learn how to be allies, how to work together, what the plans can be. The British actually do most of the planning for D-Day, because the United States is still in the process of building up its army and its staff. Remember, the UK, Britain was in the war, much earlier than the U.S. was. The U.S. was dragged pretty reluctantly into World War II after Pearl Harbor. And one of the sort of weird tensions that comes out is on the commander side, there is this enormous energy to defeating the Nazis first. The U.S. and UK policy is literally Germany first. A lot of the soldiers and military personnel, though, for the United States are angry that they are being sent to Europe, that they and I sort of have some of these voices in the book that, they're sitting there and they're saying, Hitler hasn't done anything to me. It's the Japanese who attacked the United States. Like there's a real sense in the European theater at the lower ranks that sort of they've been sent to the wrong war, which again, we sort of have such valorization of the fighting the Third Reich now in our national history that it's sort of funny to remember all of these soldiers who are so angry and disappointed to be wasting their time fighting in Europe. So sort of that part of the book stands out for me. And then, the first invasion waves, I think really stand out because of, just how scared everyone was. I think one of the things that really comes through in oral history, and it's one of the things that I really like about writing it and sort of the oral history tradition is in a lot of narrative history, and I write narrative history too, and love me good narrative history. There's a sense, I think, that events of history are neater and cleaner and simpler and more foreordained than they were to anyone who lived through them at the time. In my 9/11 history, a big part of that day and understanding how 9/11 affected the American psyche is the fear, that the way that we teach 9/11 as history now is, it's 4 planes, it was, the Pentagon, the Twin Towers, it was Shanksville, it was 3,000 people died. The whole thing starts at 8:46 in the morning. It's over 102 minutes later with the collapse of the second tower at 10:28. But that's not the day that any of us who were alive on 9/11 actually lived through. We didn't know when the attacks began. We didn't know when they were over. We didn't know how many there had been. And we didn't know what was coming next. And again, I think you see that in the D-Day book, where we see D-Day as this huge, enormous, world-changing apocal event. When you hear the voices of the soldiers writing letters home on the landing craft crossing the English Channel on the night of June 5th, when you hear the voices of the paratroopers crossing the English Channel in the dark that night, they didn't know that they were going to be heroes. They didn't know that this was going to be a triumph. They didn't know whether they were going to live to see the next day. And I think sort of capturing the messiness of history as it's actually lived, to me, is one of the great strengths of oral history.
Fascinating. And just keeping an eye on time, perhaps this is a really nice accumulating question from Bob, and others have kind of asked this question as well. As far as just the lesser known figures and people that you discuss in your book and may have discussed with Gina, who do you think is the most important for students to know about?
So I think it's a couple of different things. One is and I've sort of thought a lot about this over the last year, in particular since the book came out and the 80th anniversary, and everything that has transpired in our own country. Democracy is not a foregone conclusion for the world or our country. And I think, coming back to sort of where I started this conversation with Gina, it it is not a coincidence to me that we are watching major rollbacks in democracy here at home at the precise moment that we are losing the greatest generation who fought World War II and sort of set up and secured the global world order, uh, with the United States as sort of the North Star of democracy and international alliances afterward. That uh, and I'm speaking a little bit about the book that I've also just finished that'll come out in August, that is the story of the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb, which overlaps in an important way with the D-Day story, because so much of the Manhattan Project is the work of refugees and immigrants who flee the creeping fascism of Europe across the 1930s, and then are driven to build the atomic bomb because of their fears of that Germany will build the bomb first. And that there are these incredibly pregnant and poignant chapters in the atomic bomb book that'll come out in August. It's called "The Devil Reached Toward the Sky," about these refugees watching the cloak of fascism close across Europe, and change the way that they do science and where they are allowed to do science, and sort of them fleeing sort of a few steps ahead of the Nazi persecution of Jewish scientists, and ending up in the United States, then terrified about the possibility of a German bomb. And it takes a lot to fight fascism. It takes a lot to root out fascism once it has taken hold. And I hope that someone who reads this D-Day book today will reflect on the legacy that this generation left us, and what our responsibility is in our generation to sort of carry forward the fight for freedom that 150,000 Allied troops began in the Normandy beaches and hedgerows on June 6, 1944.
Wow, awesomely said. Perfect place to throw things back to Gina. If I didn't have time to ask your question, get your hands on this book. All your questions can be answered there. We really encourage everyone to do so, and can't wait for August as well.
Yes. And we hope you'll join us next week as we welcome the author of Presidents at War: How World War II Shaped a Generation of Presidents, from Eisenhower and JFK through Reagan and Bush, which is a perfect sort of follow-up to this week's discussion. And you can also go online at gilderlerman.org/bookbreaks and watch more than 250 scholar presentations, including Garrett's last two appearances on book breaks for Watergate and 9/11. You can also visit online for historical documents, History Now, the Hamilton Education Program, and so much more. Garrett, thank you for joining us again, and we look forward to having you back for your next book.
Yeah, thanks so much for all spending some time with me this Sunday.
Have a great day, everyone.